Are you a fan of Jaycee Gaspar? Well, if you've ever wondered which tutorials crafters love the most, we've compiled them all for you in one video. We're doing a rundown of the top Jaycee video tutorials to help you craft smarter, faster, and with more confidence. From simple techniques to creative ideas you can use on many projects, there's something here for everyone. This is a great video to bookmark and come back to whenever you need inspiration, so let's dive in. Sometimes the simplest and most basic tools can make the biggest difference. In this video, Jaycee looks at 3 tools he uses to create beautiful sentiments.
I shared this card on the March 2022 embossing folder release, and so many of you wanted to see this recreated, so luckily this is a perfect pairing, and I'll show you one easy embossing folder technique to make these beautiful dimensional embossed cards. So to make this card, it was sort of my response to the die cut inlay technique. And so for this perfect pairing, I'll call this the embossed overlay technique. So in order to create this embossed overlay technique, you'll need 3 things. First and foremost, you'll need an embossing folder. For this card, I've used the Peony Sunshine Botanical 3D embossing folder. You'll need a die with a large surface area. I used the Caps Bold Alphabet die set. And lastly, you'll need an ink of any kind. So I used the Red Sunset family of mixed media inks to create my original card. So in order to recreate this card, you'll need any ink that you can use on your embossing folder. So a dye ink or a pigment ink would work just fine to recreate this embossed overlay technique. Now I won't create this card exactly, but I'll replicate it to show you maybe a different occasion if you're not looking for a Mother's Day card, for example. So first I'll work with the Peony Sunshine embossing folder. In my opinion, some of the best results I get from embossing folders come from lighter weight cardstocks. So here I have an 80-pound cardstock. Typically I'll craft on a 110-pound cardstock weight. So first and foremost, I'll pick an orientation for my white cardstock. And I'm just doing that by looking through my embossing folder. And then I'll use the fine mister bottle, I've got water in this one, to just give me a light layer to moisten the cardstock. And this just helps preserve a lot of the detail when running this through your die cutting machine, following your embossing folder sandwich. And that's a Yanas Mukula hack for getting really great impressions on embossing folders. Now that my cardstock has the impression of the Peony Sunshine 3D embossing folder, I'm just going to remove it for a second and do an embossing folder inking technique on the text side of my embossing folder. Now, as I mentioned previously, I used the Red Sunset family of inks for my Mother's Day card. In this one, I'll switch it up a little bit and I'll use the Summer Afternoon family of inks. And I'll start with my lightest layer first on my 3D embossing folder. And I'm doing a light layer of this on my embossing folder, trying to capture the high points of the text side of my embossing folder. I'm going to slide in my embossed cardstock and lock it into the non-text side of my embossing folder. And now that I have that in there, I'll apply another light layer of water to the inked side, the text side of the embossing folder, and then run this through my die cutting machine to leave an impression of the buttercream ink. These are just really simple letterpress inking techniques that you've probably seen in another perfect pairing video of mine, which I'll link and hopefully pops up in the card here. But now that I have a light layer of buttercream, I'll go ahead and add a little bit of depth to the center of this flower. So I'll move on to the next darkest ink in the Summer Afternoon family of inks, and that's Warm Sunshine. And just as before, I'm lightly tapping the ink pad to the high points of the text side of the embossing folder. And this time I'll concentrate this ink more towards the center of the flower. I'll apply a light spray of water, and then I'll ensure my paper is locked into the non-text side of my embossing folder. And then I'll run this through my die cutting machine again. And I figured by now you all know the drill, so I went ahead and did the same thing with caramel toffee. I applied an even smaller area of this ink in the center of the flower just to give the whole bloom a sense of depth. And this cardstock is still kind of wet, so what I'll do is set this aside to dry, and I'll work on the die cut letter element to this card. With the caps bold alphabet die, I decided to spell the word U, Y-O-U, with the set of dies. And with these letter dies, I know they'll fit in the center of my Peony Sunshine embossed panel. With my previous card, I went for a tone-on-tone look, and I'll do the same thing with this set of inks. So I have the Summer Afternoon Mixed Media inks. I'll also use the Summer Afternoon Gradient cardstock set, just for that nice little subtlety, but definitely a wow factor with the tone-on-tone effect. And with the lightest cardstock in the Summer Afternoon set, so Buttercream, I went ahead and die cut the word U using my caps bold alphabet dies. And hopefully you haven't put away your embossing folder yet, so you'll bring this back out for this next step, and this is where the embossed overlay comes into play. So I've locked my embossed panel onto the non-text side of my 3D embossing folder, just as if I was going to ink up the text side again. Now I'm picking the final orientation of where I want my die cut letters to go. So I'm using a T-scale ruler to make sure that everything is lined up properly. And I don't want to run all this paper through my embossing folder. So what I'm going to do is make a hinge using my Altenew satin tape. And what I'm doing is connecting all the letters with the Altenew satin tape, but also making a hinge for myself off the side here. So I can lift these letters up, pull out my dry embossed panel, and then carefully lay down my letters on top of the embossing folder. Now that I like the orientation of my letters, I'll run this through my die cutting machine. And now my cardstock is locked in a familiar orientation in my embossing folder. Now I can carefully peel off the satin tape. And now that my letters are embossed, I can lock them back into the non-text side of my embossing folder into their familiar orientation. So just as before, I'll add ink to the non-text side directly over where my die cut letters are. And I'll use Warm Sunshine, the next darkest value in comparison to my Buttercream cardstock. And I'll do a heavier application of this ink onto the text side of my embossing folder. So now that I have adequate coverage, I'll run this through my die cutting machine with the Warm Sunshine ink. So that's the first layer with Warm Sunshine. I'll do a little gradient now that I know based on the mirror side where this ink will fall. So I'll use Caramel Toffee, and I'll apply this on the bottom half of the letters. And I haven't touched my letters, so they're still locked in place. And I'll run this through my die cutting machine just like this, with Caramel Toffee now on the text side. And now I'll wait for the letters to dry while I work on other elements to my card. To complete the U sentiment that I've been working on, I figured I'd use the Craft Your Life project kit in Dynamic Blossoms. And I'm going to complete the sentiment with the You Are Amazing. To keep the single tone theme going along, I'll stamp this on a panel of white cardstock and make a little sentiment strip using the Summer Afternoon family of inks. So I'll stamp this sentiment in Caramel Toffee. So here are the three elements to complete this card. Here is the Peony Sunshine embossed panel, my embossed letters, and then finally my little sentiment strip to complete the You Are Amazing sentiment. So I glued down my Peony Sunshine panel to a folded note card base. Before I take care of the die cut letters, I'll use a little bit of the dye ink from Caramel Toffee and apply splatters to my flower with a water brush. Depending on your wants, you can glue down your letters directly over your embossed panel for a much more subtle effect. But I really like the way my letters look with a little bit of dimension. So since there's a lot of real estate on these letters, I can use the Instant Dimension foam tape and use it to really separate the sentiment from the background. One of the last steps is adding the rest of the supporting sentiment So I foam mounted this as well. To embellish this card, I'll use the Pocket Full of Sunshine enamel dots. And that's it for the embossed overlay technique. So hopefully you can see that making these cards is really easy, and creating that dimension is as easy as using any of your Altenew 3D embossing folders. Now, just as a recap, you need 3 things to create these cards. You'll need a wonderful Altenew embossing folder. I recommend something with a lot of detail. A die set. It doesn't necessarily have to be a die set. If you want to, you can create a circle frame by using the nesting circles die. Just any die set that has a large surface area. And finally, you'll need some sort of ink to ink up your embossing folder. I used the mixed media inks, pigment inks, but you can definitely do this with your collection of Altenew crisp dye inks as well. Thank you all so much for your feedback over on my Instagram. It makes creating content really easy for the Altenew channel, so that I have a better idea of what you all want to see in my perfect pairing series.
Love crafting with 3D embossing folders? Jaycee shares his favourite hacks and creative ways to use them in this video.
Hey there everyone, welcome back. It's Jaycee for another Altenew Crafty Perfect Pairing. Embossing folders are not just for your card backgrounds. In this tutorial, let's take a look at 3 creative ways to use your Altenew embossing folders. If you have never used an Altenew 3D embossing folder before, all you need is your larger size die cutting machine. For my setup, I still need my platform. In place of the cutting plate, I used the 3D embossing folder, and will put cardstock in the folder. Then I would complete my sandwich by putting the second plate on top and cranking the handle as usual. And then when I run this through my die cutting machine, I will have beautifully textured or dry embossed paper. For my first example, let's use the 3D embossing folder like a letterpress. There is something about wedding invitations and pamphlets that come with letterpress that add a beautiful quality to the paper. We can do the same with your handmade cards. Here is Ranunculus Bouquet 3D embossing folder, new from the March 2021 stamp release. There are 2 sides to the embossing folder, one that debosses or presses into the paper, and the embossed side, or the side that presses up toward you. For this simple letterpress technique, I will use the side of the embossing folder that is raised toward the camera. I'm having the bouquet run off the card front in this orientation. And then I'll add a piece of washi to hold the paper down. Now that I have my bouquet placement on my cardstock, I'll use Obsidian pigment ink to ink up the embossing folder. I'm gently patting the high points of this image, and sometimes I'm swirling the ink pad around to pick up more of the delicate details. The most important thing I'm going to avoid is getting ink on the background part of the embossing folder, so the flat side. You'll see I'm using a towel to hopefully swipe up some of this stray ink, and then I'll run this through my die cutting machine, following the layering sandwich I mentioned earlier. I didn't get all the stray ink, which is what I'm showing you here, but it's okay, we will hide it more in plain sight. Before I do that though, I'm going to quickly add a sentiment. Something about scripty fonts and letterpress is always so timeless. I love the fonts that Altenew uses in the Paint a Flower series, especially the fonts like this one in Paint a Flower Spider Mums. I'll use the same Obsidian pigment ink to stamp the sentiment. So now I'll add black splatters using my favorite jet black ink spray and a water brush. I do this to cover up the stray pigment ink from the embossing folder, so I'm concentrating the splatters in those areas. This card front is ready for your card base, but to stay true to the letterpress feel of this card, I'm adding a deckled edge like high quality cotton papers. I find that wetting the paper where you want to tear the sheet really helps get a more desirable and uniform rip. I'm using the size 2 Altenew Artist watercolor brush in the round set to add a line of clean water to the edge of the paper. Then while the paper is saturated, I'll rip along the wet edge of the card panel. To finish this card, I'll take my folded note card base and a narrow strip of black cardstock to the left side. Then before adhering the card panel to the front, I'll gently curl up the edge of the cardstock just for more texture. That finishes this easy modern letterpress card inspired by professionally made wedding invitations. This next card follows the same principles as the first, but instead of making a background of sorts, let's see how to use an embossing folder as a foreground element. This majestic bloom 3D embossing folder has spaced apart floral elements, which makes embossing individual images fairly easy. Now, not all cardstocks are the same. In fact, I usually have to slightly mist colored cardstocks with water before running the cardstock through the embossing folder to avoid ripping the cardstock. But you'll need to test this out on your stash. I'm using a scrap panel of frosty pink to emboss only the flower image in this embossing folder. Now I'm going to apply ink to the raised portions of the debossed side of the embossing folder. In other words, the image sinks away from the camera. I'm applying Snapdragon crisp dye ink to the raised portions of the flower image. Then using the mini ink blending tool to diffuse the color a little bit. After running this through my die cutting machine, you'll see the shadows of the flower now have an orange hue. It's almost like adding stamped layers to the image. I'll add a layer of marigold, then a layer of velvet to the flower. No need to worry about ink getting on the flat side of the embossing folder. I'll repeat these steps on a panel of rouge-colored cardstock. Again, I do have to slightly mist the paper to get a crisp, dry, embossed impression. To this flower, I'll add a layer of marigold. Then a layer of velvet, just like the first flower. But then I thought, let's go crazy, and I'm going to add jet black to the high points of this embossing folder. I was inspired by those iron-on embroidered flower decals that you can add to fabric, and I thought adding black makes the flowers look a little bit more punk. But it's not too late to add black to the lighter pink flower. It's almost like layering up your Altenew stamps, but all you have to do is snap the cardstock back into place by following the raised portions of the embossing folder. Then I will add jet black to the same high points and run the folder through my die cutting machine. Like I mentioned earlier, the images of Majestic Bloom 3D embossing folder are spaced far enough apart to fussy cut. So that will be my next step. Once I have both flowers fussy cut, here's a little trick if your edges aren't quite perfect. I'm going to put the flower back into the embossing folder and run the flower through one more time. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the two flowers. One has been flattened again and one hasn't. Doing this helps smooth and curl the edges of your fussy cut cardstock and hides the cuts that were not so perfect. To complete this perfect pairing, I'm taking the very old Vintage Flowers stamp and die set. I'm first going to die cut the branch image from black cardstock twice. Then I will add so many black splatters to a white card panel using jet black ink spray again. I will use one of the detail layers of 2 of the leaf clusters in the Vintage Flowers stamp set and stamp some supporting foliage in jet black crisp ink. Then I figured I'd stamp the sentiment from the same Paint a Flower Spider Mums stamp set. Finally, I adhered the whole arrangement to my card front and card base. Don't forget that you can use your embossing folders as focal points, not just as backgrounds. Now, typically 3D embossing folders come in repeating patterns, such as the pattern found in Angled Mosaic 3D embossing folder. I used this in my February 2021 perfect pairing about adding details, but I wanted to touch on why I like to use embossing folders in this way. My concept is all about balance, so by taking a repeating background and making it not repeat or asymmetrical, you create an element of interest. I'm going to start with Lagoon cardstock, cut to 3.5 by 4 3/4 inches. The site to apply ink to has mattered in the previous 2 examples, but I'm just going to apply Enchanted Gold Pigment ink to one side of the embossing folder. Then I'll run this through my die cutting machine as normal to get this gold inlay impression. Then to make the pattern imperfect, I'm going to rip the cardstock for a deckled edge. Running the paper through the embossing folder has softened the fibers, so there's no need for me to moisten the paper as in the first card example to get a perfect deckled edge. But not all colored cardstocks are the same, so whatever works to get you a very jagged edge. To complete this perfect pairing, I'll use the March 2021 Craft a Flower Antique Rose. I didn't have the bone colored cardstock I wanted, so I first applied Altenew double-sided paper to one side of my cardstock. Then ink blended sand dunes on the other side of the 2 panels of white cardstock. So I'll cut through a lot of the layering and adhering for this flower as I'm just following the layering guide without using different colors of cardstock. I'll set this arrangement aside. On another A2 sized panel of Lagoon cardstock, I'll coordinate the pigment ink on the textured panel with the Altenew metallic watercolor in Enchanted Gold and add an array of splatters. While the metallic watercolor is hydrated, I'll enhance the deckled edge of the embossed panel by adding a thin strip of Enchanted Gold watercolor for a gilded edge. After those have dried, I'll foam mount the embossed panel on top of the gold splatter background. Then I'll add the antique rose arrangement. But before foam mounting the main flower image, I'll use the coordinating Enchanted Gold metallic thread to add a bundle behind the flower. I think the circle will help balance the grid of diamonds. Off camera, I white heat embossed the Trust sentiment on gold mirror cardstock and a supporting sentiment strip on Lagoon cardstock. To finish this card, I used the satin white sequins to frame the floral arrangement. I hope the next time you pick up your Altenew embossing folders that you look at ways to break up the patterns to make it more interesting. Again, why spend the time on a background if all it's going to do is be in the back? Those are my 3 tips and tricks on 3D embossing folders.
2025 was all about innovation and discovering new tools on how to make your crafting experience more efficient. Jaycee shares his top 3 must-haves.
Hey there, Altenew friends, welcome back to another perfect pairing with me. Let's wrap up 2024 with the crafting tools that had the greatest impact on my crafty year and how I think they will change the way I create in 2025. Before we get into today's project, make sure you subscribe to the Altenew channel for more card making and paper crafting tutorials. My Perfect Pairings with Jaycee series explores crafting techniques that effortlessly blend sure-to-love new releases and well-loved Altenew favorites. If you love these kinds of crafty tutorials, hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of my videos airing on the 2nd and 4th Sunday. The Better Press system and Altenew's pairings of Better Press plates are items that I continuously went through in 2024. One of the amazing things about the Better Press plates is that you can ink them and also foil with them. And I found the pairing of texture, ink, and shine all in one item to be so perfect for 2024, and it's just something that I kept going to every time Altenew released an Essential Textures press plate or any of their Better Press compatible items. I've shown the Essential Textures Gilded Marble press plate time and time again, but the Essential Textures collection is just an easy way to get a statement background that perfectly pairs with any of your sentiment dies. I have a panel of A2 sized white cardstock already nestled and set up in my Better Press system, and underneath the white cardstock I have the Essential Textures Gilded Marble press plates. From the Warm Gray family of inks, I'm going to use Evening Gray to ink up the press plate and transfer this ink onto my cardstock. I will also apply a little bit of Morning Frost on some of the open areas I haven't inked yet, and this will give me a slight variation of color on my press plate. And here's that result of the first layer. While my glimmer system is heating up off camera, I'll apply a little bit of ink to this panel while it's still on the platen. I'm grabbing Morning Frost again and a large ink blending brush. And I'm using Morning Frost to add a slight gradient on two opposing corners of my cardstock panel. In this Gilded Marble press plate, I feel like adding a little bit of this ink gives the illusion that the veining runs deeper into the marble. On my glimmer system, I'm going to use this gold foil and press the opposite texture on the Better Press plate onto this panel so that I end up with this foiled background. Like I mentioned earlier, I now have my statement background ready for any die cut sentiment or stamped sentiment if that's what you have. I'm filming this card a little bit before the holidays, and so I thought the Shine Bright sentiment in Timeless Sentiments 3 die set was going to be fitting and fill this entire card front. I used brushed gold cardstock to act as my offset layer for the sentiment, and then I stacked 3 layers of white cardstock with the sentiment die itself. Then I put the two together by foam mounting the sentiment onto the center of my panel, and it's already on a folded note card base. And that finishes my first favorite of 2024. I think the Better Press plates are here to stay, and I hope that Altenew continues the Essential Textures collection so that we can see more exciting Altenew backgrounds make it to the forefront. For my second tool and technique that I'm loving for 2024 that I hope carries on to 2025, I'll first showcase with the Translucent Foliage Craft Your Life Project Kit. This is the December 2024 project kit. I won't use the embossing folder on this card, so I'll focus on the die set, the stamp set, and the stencil set that are included in all of the project kits. On my original stamp wheel, I'm adding a panel of white cardstock. On my white cardstock panel, I set up images B, C, I, G, and D. And since I have Warm Gray Fresh Dye inks out already, I'll use Lava Rock to stamp these outlines. After stamping all of the outlines on my white panel, I'll transfer this cardstock to my 9x12 sticky matte grid. And I'll use the Simple Coloring Stencil Set Translucent Foliage to fill in all of the elements and outlines of this card. I want an overall light impression on these images, so I'm leaving a lot of empty white space as I'm ink blending. And for now, I'm sticking to lighter values, like Morning Frost. While Altenew has a variety of sizes for their ink blending brushes, and although I really love the mini ink blending brushes, the blending brushes I've really started to quietly gravitate toward are the detail blending brushes, which come in a tube and a set like this. And what I've really started to love doing with the stencil sets that have more of this open base layer is to incorporate little stroked details into the open areas and color them as if I'm using alcohol markers. And it doesn't require a lot of ink to add just a little bit of dimension to get that really soft yet detailed feel to your stamped images. I'm using the detail blending brush to add these stroked elements to the edge of the foliage. And you really cannot achieve this with the mini ink blending brushes. If you have the micro blending brushes, this is a great alternative as well. But what I'm doing is adding just slight little shadows and details to the edges of these leaves as if they are folding backward in the bouquet. And you'll see when I lift up the stencil on this eye layer, in comparison to the other leaves, you get just that little bit and touch of depth and dimension, and it's going to make these leaves stand out a little bit more. And then once we get into the floral elements in translucent foliage, using the detailed blending brushes is just going to make it look a little bit more polished and refined. So I'll continue with Moonrock on this G layer. And for me, I use the detail blending brushes slightly different than I would any of the flat bristles. Instead of a swirling motion with the flat bristle blending brushes, so like the large ink blending brushes, mini ink blending brushes, small ink blending brushes, I am adding this ink in a directional stroke. And I'll finish with the D layer and Moonrock. And you'll notice too, I'm starting off the stencil and bringing the ink towards the image. This way I get a nice transition of ink towards the end of my stroke. So you'll see it's sort of like a flicking motion instead of a scrubbing motion. All the leaf images are found on stencil 4, and that finishes those details. Then I'll move on to the flowers, starting with layer letter C. And for the flowers, I really want a light overall impression. So I'm starting with strawberry fresh dye ink and a mini ink blending brush. And I'm starting from the center of the flower working outwards, working this color about halfway up the petal. I'll move on to dusty pink and add just a touch of this color about a third of the way up the petal. Then with another number 5 detail blending brush, I'll do a similar technique with what I did on the leaves, which is apply directional strokes from the edges of the petals going towards the center of the flower. So that's 2 of the petals in this image. I will go ahead and fill in the remainder of the flowers that I've stamped using strawberry, dusty pink, and using my detail blending brush to blend in layers of dusty pink at the edges of the petals. So that's the coloring on the first flower. Stencil number 2 is where you'll find the layering images for image letter B. In addition to strawberry and dusty pink, I will add in blush rose just to add some variation to this bouquet. Just like the previous flower, I'll take strawberry and quickly add this ink about 2/3 of the way up the petal, dusty pink about halfway, then finally brush rose about 1/3 of the way up the petal. So really that's just a little bit to the center of this flower. However, to add the folded details to these petals, I'll still use dusty pink and the directional strokes with the number 5 blending tool. And just like the foliage, I'm starting off the stencil and pushing that ink towards the center of the flower. So there's the first 3 petals. Then after adding strawberry, dusty pink, and blush rose as my base layer, I'll finish off this image with blended areas of dusty pink. Before I move on to die cutting, I do want to redefine the center areas of these flowers. I am going to use my same stamping color, which is Lava Rock, to redefine the anther and pistil of both of these images. So I'm referring to this image here. And after this ink dries back a little bit, I'll use the translucent foliage die set to cut out the images that I stamped. After die cutting all my pieces, I planned for this sort of arrangement. And I also went ahead and stamped Have a Lovely Day in Moonrock Fresh Dye ink. And I'll use this as my sentiment banner for this bouquet. Before I glue anything to my panel, I'm actually going to create my simple background to give more of that translucent feel to this translucent foliage set of images. With a larger ink blending tool and strawberry fresh dye ink, I'm adding a gradient from the top of my cardstock down towards the center. I'm also going to add just a touch of blush rose to the very top of this, just to slightly deepen this top corner of my panel. Now I can assemble this card. I'll return the arrangement that I had originally planned earlier to this now ink blended panel. Before I add my sentiment, I want to embellish this card. I'm going to add a little bit of jet black ink spray around this bouquet. If you're a longtime watcher of my Perfect Pairing series, you'll also know I would usually add pure white ink spray to a background like this, but because I have a lot more white space than I usually do, I want to use iridescent instead. This will add a little bit of shine, and I'll get lost amongst the white background, but still add that dreamy halo that I love adding to Altenew's florals. So I'm using a watercolor brush, and I'll scatter this ink spray all around the background for that dreamy halo around this bouquet. So that this is the effect when your recipient opens their card. It's sort of dewy. It's not quite gold, not quite silver. I consider it to be like the vellum of splatter, just on a league of its own. I do want to add more shine to this background, so I'm going to try out these gem sparkles from Altenew. So I'm adding one of each size to my card background. After adding all of my desired embellishments to my card front, that finishes this card using the detailed blending brushes, which I hope to use more and incorporate into 2025, especially for the Altenew subscription products, like the Build a Garden, Altenew Craft a Flower, and any of the project kits that contain these floral ruffly images. I think these really fine ruffled details will elevate my projects going into 2025. The final tool that I want to showcase for 2024 is the Stamp Wheel 2.0. The Stamp Wheel 2.0, just like the original Stamp Wheel, has drastically changed the way I craft. And with the Altenew Stamp Wheel 2.0's detachable side, I've really started to think about my 8.5 by 11 inch Altenew stamp sets in a different way. My card compositions can be totally different now and are completely unrestricted. And as Altenew's Build a Garden sets become even bigger clusters of flowers, I think there are just so many more additional ways that you can be creative with your photopolymer stamps and the Stamp Wheel 2.0. But of course, my favorite thing to do with the Stamp Wheel 2.0 is to create multiple cards at once. I have already showcased this 4-in-1 technique in a previous perfect pairing. In that other perfect pairing, I did focus on more techniques and other images that you can use in the Stamp Wheel 2.0. This time I'll use the Bouquet of Poppies 8.5 by 11 inch stamp set and its coordinating stencil set. But first I'll stamp my images on my 8.5 by 11 inch sheet. Again, since I have the warm gray family of inks out already, I'll use evening gray to stamp the outline of this large bouquet image. Once I have this half of my panel stamped, I will rotate the paper instead of my flip plate, and the reason is if I flip my flip plate 180 degrees, I will stamp my image on top of the existing one because my rotational center is right here. So with the detachable side, I have a lot more flexibility on where I can place my images, especially for these larger ones. I just feel like I have a lot more control now about where I can repeat stamp these images. And that's why I have this piece of satin masking tape on my Stamp Wheel sticky mat. This is my reference edge that I lined up on this side to act as my rotational point. So now that I've rotated my panel 180 degrees, I'll bump it back up to my edge here. And I know I had a small margin on the top and bottom of my panel. Then I can return my flip plate using the etch opening on the top of my flip plate as my guide. And now I know I just have to repeat stamp on this segment of my full 8.5 by 11 inch sheet. And that finishes the outline on the second half of my panel. I'll use a mix of dusty pink and blush rose to fill in the open areas of these poppies. And just like the previous translucent foliage card, I'm keeping the overall impression of these flowers pretty light. So with stencil number 1 on group So with stencil number 1 on image A, now that I have this orientation, I can easily realign my image by rotating the stencil 180 degrees. And then I can quickly find my reference points by repeat stamping this large image using the Stamp Wheel 2.0. I'll repeat the dusty pink and blush rose glow on all of these poppies. So here's my blush rose and dusty pink blend. I want a little bit more control with the number 4 stencil, which fills in the majority of the foliage elements of this image. So I'm going to use the micro blending brush set. This is the number 10 size. And opposed to the detail blending brushes that I was showcasing earlier, I'm using the micro blending brush and its flat bristles this time to do the scrubbing motion and apply a halo of color to the base of the leaves and to the stems throughout the bouquet of poppies. For the impression that I want on this card, I just feel like the mini ink blending brushes are going to be just a little bit too big for the controlled application of ink that I want. So this is where I feel like the micro blending brushes fit in for these techniques, is when I want an even smaller and controlled application of ink. To fill in the centers of the poppies, I'm using a mini ink blending brush and Moon Rock to add a very clear and defined center to the poppies. Then I can rotate my stencil 180 degrees and quickly find my reference lines in the openings of the image and repeat this inking technique with the micro blending brushes on this half of my stencil. And I'll finish off the remaining foliage pieces found on stencil number 5 as well, using Morning Frost and Moon Rock. The illustration of Bouquet of Poppies reminds me of Chinese ink paintings, which is why I decided to stick to this two-tone hue throughout the ink blending of this image. Before I split apart this panel into my 4 cards, I'm going to add a very dilute jet black ink spray splatter throughout the open areas of this grouping of images. After completely filling the background and all the open areas between the poppy images with this dilute jet black ink spray splatter, I'm going to add some metallic watercolor splatter as well, and I'm using Gold Pearl just because it matches the first card I made. And I'll add this pigment more on top of the poppies themselves. Once this is dry, I can take it to my paper trimmer and cut each segment into 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch panels. And now I have 4 panels ready for sentiments. Instead of using the sentiments found in the Bouquet of Poppies stamp set, I decided to mix it up with the Amy Tangerine collection, so I have Wild One and Shine Bright sentiments. And I will individually stamp each of these panels with a sentiment that I feel like fits inside of my card front. In my stamp wheel, I'm going to switch out the radial grid plate for the grid plate so that I know that my sentiments are horizontally straight on my card base. I'll stamp the sentiments in Obsidian pigment ink. Now I have 4 stamped panels ready for folded note card bases, and that finishes my last technique and tool that has changed the way I craft for 2024. I hope that you bring some of these techniques into 2025, and I'll be sure to be there with you for more perfect pairings into the new year.
If you need some extra inspiration for your card backgrounds, Jaycee has you covered with these unique ideas.
Hi there everyone, welcome to another perfect pairing. Card background techniques continue to be some of the most popular tutorials online. In this tutorial, I'll share 3 of my favorite card making techniques for beautiful backgrounds. I'm sure that these card background making techniques will enhance your focal element on any of your Altenew projects. So when I think of really easy and quick ways to make beautiful backgrounds, one of the first crafty items that comes to mind is by using one of my wide selection of stencils. So the first item I wanted to showcase is the fairly old Watercolor Stripes stencil. Onto my Crafter's Essential stamping mat, I'm going to get a rough placement of where I want this stencil to go. And on here I want to try to create a light drop shadow. So once I have a rough placement of where I want this to go, I'm I'm going to lower it slightly down and over to the right and tape down my stencil to my craft mat. I'm going to take a really light gray ink. I'll use Morning Frost from the Warm Gray family of inks. And in my small ink blending tool set, I have 2 of the sets of 4 so that I encompass all of the colors, a brown and a black. And I'll apply a barely visible layer of this ink. The majority of this is going to be covered up, so I'm not so concerned about getting this really even. However, I do want a fairly defined edge, so this is okay for me. Now, since I have enough real estate to create a rainbow array of colors on my background here, and all of the ink blending tools that coordinate with that, I'll go ahead and make this a rainbow striped background. But before I do that, I will pick up my stencil again. So I'm going to recenter my stencil on top of my card front. Alright, so now my stencil is back in the original orientation that I had planned before. And for this layer, I want intense saturation to try to cover up the gray that I have behind these exposed areas. So I'm working in Pink Pearl first, then Heartbeat, then Orange Cream, Warm Sunshine, Grass Field, Lagoon, Persian Blue, Deep Iris, and finally Pinkalicious. So you'll see I haven't put anything away yet because I'll need it for the second step. But before I do that, I'm just going to take a quick peek at what this looks like. Okay, good. So I have a nice little drop shadow underneath each of the stripes, and each layer has adequate saturation and a defined edge. So I like that. I'm going to replace the stencil. I'm going to amp up the look of this stencil and tie it with another crafty item for this card. The next stencil I'll be using on this background is the Milky Way stencil, which is a star layering stencil. These images fit within this one. And without removing the watercolor stripes stencil, I'm going to overlay the Milky Way stencil on top. Actually, I'll use the larger images, just so that they show really nicely through the other stencil. Once I've picked an orientation that I like, I'll tape this stencil down, and I will repeat the stenciling steps as I did before, but this time I'm moving on to a darker color on top of the previous layer. So in the first layer on top, I used Pink Pearl, so now I'll move to Coral Bliss, then Vineyard Berry, then Autumn Blaze, Caramel Toffee, and I'm going to move my image now, and hopefully you can see the effect that I'm getting. I've repositioned my stencil, so now there's just a continuous flow of the stars. So I'll move on to the next darkest layer of green. So I used Green Field, I'll use Shadow Creek. On this next layer for the green area of the watercolor stripes stencil. Then I used Emerald for the blue-green layer, Sapphire for the blue layer, Midnight Violet for the purple layer, and finally Razzleberry for this last red-violet layer. So now I can reveal this layer. Before I remove this, I'm going to do a little bit of ink bleaching. To do this, I'm just adding a little bit of water to my craft mat and a clean water brush. And I'm just adding splatters to this ink just to push the dye ink into my white cardstock. And I like this because it lets me add splatter without taking away from a lot of the white space in this background. This is my finished rainbow background. It's got the drop shadow from the gray ink, a nice array of colors from the watercolor stripe stencil, and also the added double exposure from the Milky Way stencil for the stars. There's obviously a lot to notice and pick up on this background, so I'm going to keep the focal point really simple on this card. So here's my dried background. Like I said, I thought the star motifs were going to work well with the focal element of my card front. So off camera, I used the Splatter Constellations stamp and die set to cut out a little Splatter Aquarius constellation image. I figured by the time this video publishes, it's going to be Aquarius season. But before I assemble this card and stamp the Happy Birthday Aquarius sentiment, I figured it'd be nice to break up the continuity of this background by raising it up a little bit. So I'm going to take the deckled edge die that's in Mix and Match Frames die set and cut this deckled edge out of the center of my striped background. So after using the Mix and Match Frames die set to raise the watercolor stripes panel off of the card, I added the Happy Birthday Aquarius sentiment and the die cut Splatter Aquarius constellation onto my card front and finished this card with essential black and white enamel dots, just the white ones, around my card. So this is just an easy way to add a little bit more interest and tie in your focal point into your stenciled background. To play along with the rainbow happy birthday theme I had in the previous card, I'll continue that motif with this card in creating another really easy and interesting watercolor background. So what I'm going to start with first is the 9x12 watercolor paper pad. And I like to cut the sheets down to quarters, so roughly 6 inches by 4.5 inches. The next thing you'll need is the watercolor pencil, woodless watercolor pencils. This is a 24 set. And of course, these colors coordinate with your existing Altenew color stash. And just as before, I'm going to pull a rainbow array of colors from this set. So I'll start with Coral Bliss. And what I'm going to do is take a regular pair of scissors and open them so that the blade is exposed. Or one of the knives in the mixed media palette knife set, which is what I'm going to do for this card. And what I'm going to do is scrape this color off of the woodless watercolor pencil. So woodless meaning that the entire pencil itself contains the watercolor pigment. So I've got a fine dusting of Coral Bliss on the top left corner of my card. And then I'll just go in order. So I'll pick up Heartbeat. And I'll do the same thing. I'm going to slightly overlap this color on top of Coral Bliss. And of course, the more pigment you apply to your watercolor paper, the more vibrant your end results will be. Then I'll move on to Maple Yellow, then Grass Field. And so if you don't have the Altenew Mixed Media palette set, you could also just use your regular pencil sharpener and keep the shavings in a bowl or something. And then you can use your fingers and almost sprinkle it on top of your watercolor panel. I'm applying a little bit of Mountain Mist, then Turquoise, then finally Lavender Fields, and Rubellite. So I've got that color cascading from top left to bottom right corner. The next thing I'll grab is the iridescent Altenew ink spray. This ink spray will add a wonderful light layer of shine to this background. Now before I spray this directly onto my watercolor paper, I am going to do a little test spray just to make sure I have the ink flowing. And then pretty high up, I'm going to add this to my background, and you'll see that this will resuspend the woodless watercolor pigment. So I've added that quite liberally to my background. I'm going to very carefully lift and gently move this pigment on my watercolor panel. And this is why I like to use the larger panels of watercolor cardstock, so that I can cut out the corners that will get really muddy from the colors touching each other a lot, and then you'll get like a mix of brown, for example. And if I feel I need more concentration of color in certain areas, like I've lost a little bit of the red up here, just have to take the pencil again, and while the paper is still wet, just gently scrape a little bit more pigment onto my watercolor paper. So again, I've used the iridescent ink spray to resuspend the woodless watercolor pencil pigment, and then I'll lift it and move it around just to get a really nice mix. Okay, so I like the concentration of color on my background here. Now I can put this back onto my stamping mat and use my heat tool to quickly dry off this watercolor panel. So now that my background is dry, I can go ahead and trim off the excess to an A2 size card front. So that's 4¼ by 5½. So here's my trimmed watercolor background on my folded note card base. And you can see that I got rid of those muddy corners. And to keep this arrangement really simple, I decided to use a really small stamp set. This is the Mini Delight birthday banner. And of course, all Mini Delights come with their coordinating dies. And off camera, I went ahead and made the focal point to this card, which was just this stamped banner in black ink, stamped onto some scrap white cardstock. I double foam mounted the main banner right in the center of my cardstock, and then I adhered the tail end pieces around the center banner. And then I finished this card with a few satin gold sequins around my main sentiment. And that finishes this second really easy background to make, of course in an array of rainbow colors as well. But this looks great in monochrome, and you can go ahead and stamp on top of this for even more interest around your sentiment banners or other sentiment die cuts. This next background technique is still very amorphous and is loosely based on the Japanese suminagashi type of paper marbling. We can achieve that effect very simply with a little vessel of water here. I've got an old Tupperware container that I used just for crafts, filled with just roughly ½ inch of water. For this effect, you'll need either photo paper or the specialty paper, Yupo paper, for alcohol ink techniques, and also your mixture of Altenew artist marker refills. For now, I'll keep this monochrome, and I'm using Soft Lilac and Midnight Violet artist marker refills. These are the refills from set B of the Altenew artist markers. And I've already trimmed down my Yupo paper to 4¼ and 5½ inches. And I have a paper towel here to lay this down when I'm done. So, very simply, I'm just going to add just a few drops of the Altenew artist marker refills to the surface of my water, and you'll see it immediately disperse on here. I'm going to use a piece of paper that I grabbed from my trash can to add little bits of ink around the surface of my water, as if I'm painting on the water surface, just as what is typically done for suminagashi. Okay, so I think that's pretty adequate, and all I have to do now, very gently, I'm going to curve it into a U shape, because I don't want this alcohol ink to cover my entire Yupo paper background. I'm just going to press this in, roll it towards me, roll it away from me, and we'll see what comes up on the front of my Yupo paper from this technique. So I'm just going to blot off the excess water to my paper towel here and let this air dry on the surface of my paper towel. So I want a little bit more color intensity on here, so I'm going to do another layer. I've just lightly wiped the surface of the water just to get a little bit of the excess off. And then I'll add a few more drops of the Soft Lilac. Let's see, just for fun, I'm going to add a little bit of Lavender Fields. This is all still from the Set B family of Altenew artist marker refills. And I think this is enough purple for my background. I'm going to add in a darker color. So this is still from the Set B family. This is Lava Rock, and it's from the Warm Gray family of inks. And I won't add too much of this. And I don't want to add too much of that because it's really dark. In fact, I might dilute it with more of that Soft Lilac just to get it to break up a little bit on the surface of my water. And again, my Yupo paper is dry from the water. And I will press this into the surface again. And after adding a few more layers of that ink in different mixes to my water here, I think I've come up with a really interesting and really textural background for my focal piece. Now I will let this fully dry on some paper towels while I work on my focal element. So here's my finished background. It sort of reminds me of terrazzo tiles with the large pieces of alcohol ink dispersed throughout my background. Off camera, I decided to use one of my favorites. This is the Beauty Within stamp, die, and coordinating stencil bundle. However, I'm just going to use the stamp and die set today. I already stamped a panel of white cardstock in permanent black ink, and I also used the coordinating alcohol inks from set B to color in the flower and leaf image here. So then I'll use the coordinating die set to cut out these images. So on my cutting mat, I've planned for this arrangement. And just so I can adhere the vellum without showing the adhesive, I'm going to adhere these excess flap pieces to the back of my Yupo paper. And now I can adhere my terrazzo type background to my folded note card base. To finish this card, I'm adding white enamel dots. This is the same set as earlier. And that finishes this paper marbling card inspired by the Japanese suminagashi technique by using your Altenew artist marker refills on Yupo paper or photo paper. So again, these are background techniques inspired by things you hopefully already have in your Altenew stash. And these background elements perfectly balance my foreground centerpieces here.
Let's face it, floral card designs are timeless, and you can never go wrong with choosing some floral stamps or dies. In this video, Jaycee shares his favourite tools to create stunning blooms.
Hi there, Altenew friends. Happy Valentine's Day. It's Jaycee for another perfect pairing. It's no secret that Altenew makes some of the best layering stamps. In this tutorial, I'm going to share a few of my well-loved crafty tools to make the most out of your Altenew floral layering stamps. Altenew offers many floral layering stamps. I've gotten feedback that you all would like to see how I get diffuse and soft florals with just dye inks. If you're unfamiliar with the Altenew stamp sets, here is Queen Anemone Layering Floral Stamp Set. The images are made to layer on top of each other in different colors of ink to create beautiful and dimensional images. Some of these stamp sets have a simple coloring stencil or a coordinating steel die. With these tools, you can add additional layers of color with the simple coloring stencil, or use the coordinating steel dies to cut the images out with a die cutting machine. That is the very basics of these layering images, and fortunately all of these tools can be found on the Altenew store, and I've got all of these products linked below. In my mini-sized stamp positioning tool, this is the Mini Misty from My Sweet Petunia, I have a plain panel of white cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. In the lid of the Misty, I have the base layer of the Queen Anemone, or the most solid layer, already positioned. Before I put any ink on these stamps, I use the Altenew Stamp Conditioning Eraser Set. The large flat sides of this product enables me to take the shine off the photopolymer surface, so I get crisp impressions of ink. Now that my stamp is conditioned, I'll pick up my first ink color. This is Rouge from the Red Sunset family of crisp dye inks. Just a quick tip on this too, I use a liquid adhesive to glue my paper pieces and cardstock panels. This eraser easily removes stray and unwanted dry adhesive from my cardstock. Now that my stamp is conditioned, I'll pick up my first ink color. This is Rouge from the Red Sunset family of crisp dye inks. And I'll also use the Mini Ink Blending Tool. The wonderful thing about the Mini Ink Blending Tool sets is that they come in sets of 4 per package. So I have 2 sets for 8 ink blending brushes. I can dedicate each brush to red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, brown, and black. And I color code them accordingly with these paper adhesive dots that I have laying around. With my red dedicated Mini Ink Blending Tool and Rouge Crisp ink, I'll apply my first layer. Now typically, like shown on the layering example in the stamp product trifold, you could apply a solid layer of ink and get a solid image. But I'll show you a different way of applying ink, and you'll need the Mini Ink Blending Tool, a stamp positioning tool like the Misty, and Altenew crisp inks. What I'm going to do instead of applying ink to the entire stamp surface is apply Rouge crisp ink to only the perimeter of the stamp image. I have a panel of white cardstock underneath the lid just so you all can see the ink on the stamp. Then with my red family dedicated ink blending tool, I'll in essence blend and diffuse the ink. This isn't a very gentle process to diffuse the ink, and I'll do this for much longer than I think I need because I find I get smooth gradients. And if the ink saturation is too little, I can always apply another layer of ink. Once I've gotten a diffused layer of ink, I'll go ahead and swing the Misty door over and stamp the first layer onto my white cardstock panel. I like this impression, so I'll continue on with blush crisp ink. I'll do the same thing as before, but this time I'll concentrate on bringing the diffused ink more toward the center of the flower. Diffusing this ink on the surface of the stamp is harder to see, but that's why I tamp the ink blending tool more than what I think I need to soften the ink. Once I feel like I have a good gradient, I'll swing the Misty lid over and stamp the image. I'll move on to the two outline images in Queen Anemone shown here. And I've already positioned them in my Misty lid. For my first ink layer using this image, I'll add rouge to the perimeter of the image like the first layer. Diffuse the ink. And then stamp the image just as I've done before. However, now I want to add some depth to the center of the flower, like how flowers in nature are usually darker towards the center. I'll use ruby red crisp ink and apply a small amount to the center of the stamp. Then like before, I'll use the red ink blending tool and diffuse the ink outward toward the end of the petals until I feel I've gotten a smooth gradient. Essentially what we are doing here is painting with the crisp inks, but instead of using watercolor brushes, we are using the stamp as our brush, the ink as our coloring medium, and the ink blending tool like water to move the color around. And as with any coloring project, it is normal to assess and add layers as needed. For example, I want to darken the perimeter of the top flower a little bit more. I'm going to bring back the most solid layer stamp and ink up the perimeter. Blend out the crisp ink, and finally stamp the image. Also, flowers are seldom one color. Sometimes you'll see hints of yellow or purple in the centers of the flower. It's these fine details that help elevate your floral layers. With that being said, I'll add a little bit more depth on the solid image by using purple wine from the rose petal family of inks. I'm being deliberate in where I apply this color. In the top flower, I'm only applying ink to the center as normal. However, on the bottom flower, I want to add depth in the center as well, but this petal folds over, making things a little different. So you'll see I'm applying ink to the center of the image, but also at the base of the petal that covers the center of the flower. And that's how I'm painting this image. Then I'll diffuse the ink as normal and stamp the layer. I repeated this with Cosmic Berry, and you'll see I still get areas of white space on my flower, but now there is depth to each petal in the final layered image. That finishes the layering on the petals. For the stamen and pistils, I won't do too much shading. I simply stamped the outline image in jet black. Then the anther layer in jet black. Finally, I'll stamp the filament and pistil in Cosmic Berry. Moving on to the leaves, I'm going to start with the outline layers in Forest Glades. I'm using the outline layer as a guide to help make sure I have space on my panel of white cardstock. Then I'll use the detail layer and partially ink and stamp in evergreen, just like the flower layers. I have a dedicated green mini ink blending tool. Both of these colors so far have been from the Greenfields family of inks. I want a dark eucalyptus kind of green, so I'm also layering Moon Rock from the warm gray family of inks using my black mini ink blending tool. The stamp set does not have a solid layer stamp, which is why it's important to use the coordinating simple coloring stencil. I'm starting with the largest leaf cluster first, and ink blending evergreen and lava rock in layers to help get the deep eucalyptus color I'm looking for. I'm making sure that I get an even gradient all the way to the leaf tips. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the other two leaves. In the end, I love the contrast between the dark leaves and bright flowers. I was going with an anemone trend for this bouquet, so I figured build a flower anemone would pair beautifully with the queen anemone flowers. I love the look of the white anemone with a hint of deep purple centers and black stamens and pistils. So using the same tools and tricks as earlier, I'll make the previously mentioned flower by painting with inks and stamps. I'm starting off with a puffy heart in the center of the most solid layer stamp from Build a Flower Anemone. I'll do a few layers of this until I get the saturation I want. Like I mentioned earlier, I want this to be a white flower, so I'm very lightly stamping Morning Frost and diffusing the ink just so I get enough of an outline to see and line up the layers. Before removing this stamp, I'm going to ink up and stamp just the stamen parts of the image in jet black. I'm being careful not to darken the rest of the outline of the flower image. I'll move on to the detail layer of the anemone. I have Morning Frost again, and I'm making sure this is very light as well. I am barely applying ink toward the center of the image and diffusing the ink out with the mini ink blending tool. This layer is just barely visible on camera. I'll finish this layer with the central mound image in jet black and the anthers in jet black. I'll do the same thing with the leaves as the Queen Anemone leaves. I'll start with a light outline using Forest Glades, then a diffused detail layer of evergreen. Then to make these leaves slightly different than the darker Queen Anemone ones, I'll stamp the base solid layer in Forest Glades and diffuse the ink. Then finally finish with a diffused layer of Moon Rock. I have many examples and tutorials on the Altenew channel and Altenew Academy over floral composition. For now, I'll skip through arranging the flowers and show you the final product, as the main point of this video is to share how I get these diffused ink painted flower layers using a few crafty tools. I'll quickly share one more example of diffused inked flowers using the February 2021 Build a Flower Bellaroma Hybrid Tea Rose. I realize not everyone has access to the letterpress type stamp positioning tool like the Misty, but I know many of you have acrylic blocks, especially the ones with grid lines. I got my acrylic block set from a big box store. However, the Altenew set comes in a better variety of sizes, and I have that linked in the description box. The etched line spacing is in US Imperial at every ½ inch. I will use these etched lines in the acrylic block to line up and match with the lines on my Altenew cutting mat. The Altenew cutting mat is the only surface I craft on, and I try my best to keep it pristine for filming. I love the 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 A2 landscape or portrait alignment grid. There is a larger 12 by 12 alignment grid for your scrapbook layouts too. To perfectly align layers, I'm using these half panel sheets cut to 2 3/4 by 4 1/4 inches. I am taping my paper to my cutting mat, following a perpendicular set of grid lines. I'll lay down my stamp onto my paper, and then use the grid lines on the acrylic block to match up to my cutting mat. I'll pick up my stamp, and now I have several referral points when bringing the stamp back over to my white cardstock panel. I'm simply aligning the grid of the acrylic block to the grid of the cutting mat so that I stamp in the same position that I had first picked up my stamp. This just helps further refine the alignment of floral stamp layers if you don't have a stamp positioning tool. And this is especially helpful for floral layers that have been stamped in darker ink. What I mean is darker layer inks hide the reference lines in your Altenew layering stamps, like what you see here. So having another reference point like grid lines helps get perfectly aligned layers. Here is another example with the leaves in Bellaroma Hybrid Tea Rose. The dark blue leaf detail layer is difficult to look through in the acrylic block. So having the acrylic block etched lines match with the Altenew cutting mat grid lines helps create another reference point when picking up and stamping images. This technique is also helpful with images that don't have many reference points like shown on your Altenew packaging trifold. This is Altenew's airbrushed flowers. I thought these floral images paired perfectly with Bellaroma Hybrid Tea Rose flowers. Some of the detail layer stamps are challenging to keep perfectly aligned without a secondary reference grid like the acrylic block and cutting mat if you don't have a stamp positioning tool. If you're trying to keep light flowers like these bright yellow ones, it may be difficult to keep your layers perfect just by looking through the stamp. So after stamping all the layers of the flowers from Build-A-Flower Bellaroma Hybrid Tea Rose and airbrushed flowers, I die cut all the images and arranged them on my card front, similar to the first card. And that finishes my 2 examples and my secrets to perfectly blended and layered florals. I love to paint these flowers with Altenew's collection of crisp inks, stamps, and blending brushes.
Looking to use up your stash of pattern paper? Jaycee has you covered with 3 ways to incorporate them in beautiful projects.
Hi there, Altenew friends, it's Jaycee for another crafty perfect pairing. Tucked away in my card making stash are pads of unused and pristine pattern papers. I know you have them too. Let's explore 3 easy ways to use pattern papers that go beyond your basic background panels. For my first project, lately I've been using this grid cover die quite often. The grid cover die cuts a full A2 size panel with 17 rows and 13 columns. And my first step for this card is going to be cutting a white piece of cardstock using the grid cover die. I'm going to set this aside and work on the next piece to my card. I'm planning for this card to have a really intense focal point, so I'm going to try to keep it really simple with the sentiment by using the Mega Hello die. But before I die cut any white cardstock with this set, I'm going to add a little bit of metallic splatter just for a little bit of shine and interest. From the 14 metallic watercolor pan set, I'm going to grab citrine, add a generous helping of water to the pan, and then using a watercolor brush, I'm going to add a generous amount of splatter to this panel. I die cut the hello sentiment 3 times using white cardstock and stacked them and glued them on top of each other. And then for my last layer, I'm going to use that metallic speckled die cut to glue on top of this one. I have a final die cut stack of 4 layers of cardstock, including the last speckled layer, for just a bit of shine and a little bit of interest on this hello sentiment. I will set this aside along with the grid, the white cardstock grid I cut from earlier, and start working on the main purpose of this video, which is the pattern paper. The paper pack I'm going to be using for this first card is the poured acrylic 6x6 paper pack. I'm more interested in this panel right here. So now that I have the cardstock that I want, I'm going to use my larger paper trimmer here and cut strips of this cardstock slightly less than 1/4 of an inch. So I'm not going quite to that line on my paper trimmer. Like I mentioned earlier, this grid cover die cuts rows of 17 and columns of 13. So I'm going to cut 13 of these slightly less than 1/4 of an inch strips. And I did keep the orientation and the order the same as I cut them. Now here comes the fun part and the point of this video is I'm bringing back my white cardstock grid, and I'm just simply going to weave this through to create a basket weave pattern. So in this case, I'm going to go from right to left, and I started from the back side of my grid and went in. So this next one, I'm going to go into my grid and then up. And as I continue this, you'll see that alternating the orientation of which I go into my grid will result in this sort of bricklay or subway tile type look. I don't know how many of you also crochet or knit, but there's something sort of therapeutic about doing these, which is why I enjoy doing it quite often. But if you cut your strips narrow enough so that they slide easily through the openings in the grid, getting a rhythm down is quite easy, and yeah, it sort of becomes a little bit meditative. And here I am on my last strip. Just going to keep working this through. And here we go, here's my final pattern bricklay for this card. If I want to change my mind, I could always use the back side. But I still really like the front part and the front color palette of this card. Now before I cut off any of this overhang, I'll just apply a small bit of adhesive to these frayed edges. And once I have this trimmed down, I can glue it down to my notes card base. And before I adhere my hello sentiment onto my card fronts, I'm going to cut the tail end off of the O on hello, just so that it fits a little bit better on my portrait orientation for my card. And after gluing down the hello sentiment to my card front, that finishes this really interesting paper pieced subway tile type background. I like paper piecing like this in repetitive backgrounds, especially for those pattern papers that you don't know quite what to do with, but you want something a little bit more exciting than just making it a background. And here I have it more as a statement piece, but the bricklay pattern sort of complements the scripty and flowy style of the hello die cuts. So speaking of paper piecing, for this next card project, I'm going to make a floral arrangement inspired by decoupage. And what I needed for this card project is a bold outline stamp set, like Wavy Roses stamp set, that has elements that are going to be easy to cut by hand, and that also doesn't have a layering component. So this stamp set is purely a 6x8 stamp set with outline images and coordinating sentiments. In my stamp positioning tool, I'm going to place and stamp these 2 large images. Now I'm going to leave the stamps in my stamp positioning tool, and then I'm going to grab the Enjoy the Ride 6x6 paper pack. This was part of a scrapbook collection, the Enjoy the Ride scrapbook collection from Altenew. And I'm just going to grab a few of the scraps I have of this sheet maybe this one and possibly one of these green striped ones. I'm going to take out my white cardstock and set it aside for a second. And then I'm going to position and stamp my scrap pieces in my stamp positioning tool, leaving the stamps where they are on the lid of my MISTI. Using the same jet black crisp ink, I'm going to stamp the images directly onto this pattern paper. I'm going to repeat that on the other two panels of pattern paper. So that's the brush stroke sort of peachy pink and this pink periwinkle and black pattern paper as well. Oh, well, it looks like I might have shifted this paper. That's okay. I'm going to disregard this layer and we'll come back to that idea that I was going for. But in the meantime, I'm still going to leave these in my stamp positioning tool and set this aside for a moment. Now I'm going to use my white cardstock panel with the outline images as a map. And what I'm going to do with my colored cardstock pieces is fussy cut them and arrange them like so. Sort of like making your own puzzle pieces. As I go, I can use a liquid adhesive to glue down my cut paper pieces as I start coloring these outline images with my pattern paper. I guess you can think of this as sort of a mosaic inlay, but this is essentially what I'm doing is I'm cutting the pattern paper like decorative glass. Then I'm following a template to adhere the pattern paper or a stained glass. So that's my green element for these leaves. So that's the leaf portion of my map here. I'm going to move on and start cutting out pieces from both flower clusters here. And I am following the same procedure for the petals of the flowers. Is I'm cutting out my stained glass or my pattern paper, and then following my guide, I'm going to place and adhere my pattern paper piece. I'll do the other flower off camera, but I'll move on to the next principle for this mosaic and stained glass type flower. Like I showed you all earlier, I mis-stamped this panel, and what I was going to do was use pieces of this pattern paper to fill in the rest of the flower and open space that I have on this mosaic. But instead I'll use some solid washi tape to sort of balance out this whole appearance. I'm using the Tea Party washi tape set, and by using the transparent qualities of washi tape, I can gently fill in these other areas of my flower. So what I'm going to do is use my finger as a brayer and adhere the washi tape to a petal that I want to cut out. And then using a craft knife, I'm only going to apply enough pressure to cut the washi tape, but not the paper. And unlike the pattern paper, I'm going on the inside of the black outline. I'm going to peel back the washi tape. And what I have now is a solid layer of washi tape that fills in this petal. I can use other washi tapes as well. This is another one from the Enjoy the Ride scrapbook collection. This is from a washi tape bundle, but I would be careful with these darker portions on the washi tape, as it might make it really hard to see your black outline on the map underneath. Alright, so again, for my last piece on this flower, I'm going to burnish. I think I said brayer earlier, you know, just words sometimes. I meant burnish. I'm going to burnish the tape onto this open space, and then use my craft knife to go around and cut on the inside portion of the black outline. And I'm not applying too much pressure. My blade is sort of dull, so I'm not applying too much pressure, just enough to cut the tape, but not the paper underneath. And then I'm going to carefully remove the negative space from the washi tape. And there we go, that's the first set of petals done. I'll repeat the same idea on the remaining portions of the leaves. So the reason why I didn't move the stamps from my stamp positioning tool is now I can fill in these sort of empty areas that I have, or the gaps that I have between these mosaic pieces, and I can restamp them, and hopefully it'll give it more of a perfected appearance. So I'm orienting my white cardstock panel back in my stamp positioning tool. I like to orient my pieces to my top right corner, so that's what I've done. And then I'm going to bring back the same dye ink up the images, And before I fully depress, I'm just going to absolutely verify that I have everything lined up, and I do. And then I'm going to press this down. And hopefully the ink will fill in between those gaps. And this will also help hide some of my imperfect cutting around the paper pieces. So there we go. Now I can remove these stamps from my stamp positioning tool and worry solely about this cardstock piece. I went ahead and used the coordinating dies for Wavy Roses stamp set to die cut both of my images for my card. I skipped ahead and pre-planned for this arrangement using my Altenew cutting mat. And I regret that I have this misstamped piece here, so I'm actually going to turn it around, and luckily there's a lot of floral elements that I can supplement to my existing arrangement that I can fussy cut and arrange to fill in some of these gaps I have here in my floral bouquet. I skipped much further ahead and added a sentiment to my splattered background, and now I'm simply using the Instant Dimension foam tape to adhere all my floral elements to my card front. And once I adhere down my final floral element to my card front, that finishes my mosaic inspired floral arrangement featuring some interesting pattern paper. For my final card, I want to show you all that the Craft a Flower monthly subscription service is not just for your gradient cardstocks. You can see here that your gradient cardstocks will make a beautiful and colorful arrangement, but you can use your Craft a Flower series with patterned papers for a much more interesting, playful, and bold arrangement. So here I have the Wildflower 6x6 paper pack. Again, this comes from the Wildflower scrapbook collection. And luckily in this set, there is a slight gradation of color that will coordinate beautifully with the layering set found within Craft a Flower Peruvian Lily. Craft a Flower Peruvian Lily requires 6 different colors. I have 4 of them here in lightest to darkest tonality from what I have gathered from the layering image from the Craft a Flower packaging, so that my color tones match with the layering set here so that I still get a dimensional flower. Now for the yellow and orange portions, I've decided to supplement this mix with scraps of the gradient cardstock set. This one is in Summer Afternoon, so that coordinates with the Summer Afternoon layering family of inks. And essentially I'll just start die cutting. Now I won't show the whole die cutting process, I'll just show the final layers that I have once I finish cutting all the pieces to this Craft a Flower set. So here are my layers for 2 different flowers here. They're essentially the same except for this one. I just decided to use the reverse side of what's on this 3rd detail layer, just for a little bit of variation between the 2 flowers. But this is the order that it should go in according to my layering guide, is from top to bottom, and then of course all of these auxiliary pieces here that help supplement the flower. But for the most part, these are the major elements or major layers that will get glued on top of each other. So this will go onto this one, this on top of this, and then this one on top of this one. So I will go ahead and do that now using a liquid glue, and I'll show you the final results of assembling all of these pieces of pattern paper and a few pieces of gradient cardstock. My 2 flowers are almost complete, and before I glue these pieces onto my flower, I just wanted to take a look at this to see if I like how much dimension I'm getting, because I actually have another tip for you for these pattern paper flowers. For me, these detail blending brushes aren't just for stencils and getting into those fine areas. I think these detail blending brushes are also great for painting with ink. I'm going to use the Golden Sunset family of inks from Altenew, and I'm going to use these colors to sort of supplement and paint over some of these areas that I want darker. But essentially what I'm doing here is I'm doing light strokes of almost ink blending on these tips of the petals and other areas that I want a little bit of depth. Now, because of the small footprint of these brushes and the really fine bristles, I'm going to end up picking up a lot more ink just with a few taps of my brush. So you can see right away the sort of change I'm getting and the drama that I'm getting at the base of the petals here. just to add a little bit more darkness. And again, I'll apply just a few touches to the tips here, just for a little bit more interest. You can immediately see the difference between these two. I realize that they're different layers, but right away you can see the sort of depth that you get just by adding a little bit of ink to the flowers. So I will do the same with this one here, but I won't go as intense. I'll use Snapdragon for the other flower, and again, I don't have to use a lot of ink to get a lot of dimension on these petals. And just like that, I'm ready to start gluing down the anther portions to these flowers. So I skipped forward quite a lot, and all I simply did was cut just the solid layer for the leaves, using the same cardstock pack, the Wildflower 6x6 paper pack, and then I added my sentiment using the same inks as the detail brushing that I did earlier. And then lastly, I'm going to foam mount and adhere my most foreground flower to my card front. So just as a recap for this card, I used a variety of pattern papers, but I made sure to pay attention to their tonality so that I can use them in a layering die cut set. And then of course, for a little bit of added dimension, I used the detail blending brush to add little pops of color on tips of petals or the base of petals, just for a little bit more shadow. And if this layout looks familiar to you, I actually did something similar for the release, so I just straight up copied myself on this card. But yeah, that finishes this layered die cut pieced flower with a little bit of dimension from the help of the detail blending brushes. So as a recap, we weaved, paper pieced, and layered pattern paper in this card making tutorial.
Easy doesn't always mean basic. In this video, Jaycee teaches you how to create 4 different cards that are simple yet breathtaking.
Hey there, Altenew friends, welcome back to another perfect pairing with me. Making multiple cards at one time has never been easier with this revolutionary crafting tool. Keep watching to see how this incredible stamping platform will save you so much time. Before we get into today's project, make sure you subscribe to the Altenew channel for more card making and paper crafting tutorials. My Perfect Pairings with Jaycee series explores crafting techniques that effortlessly blend sure-to-love new releases and well-loved Altenew favorites. If you love these kinds of crafty tutorials, hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of my videos airing on the 2nd and 4th Sunday. I remember when the original stamp wheel came out, that Altenew billowing peonies and its coordinating stencil were all the craze. I thought the large floral images were so fun to color with the coordinating stencil, or any of the artistry by Altenew mediums, like woodless coloring pencils, Altenew artist markers, and even watercolor. But with the 7.5-inch platform size, you could really only do this single orientation here, and you had to trim down your cardstock panels to 7.5 inches square. But now with the Stamp Wheel 2.0, we have a large 9-inch square panel, and now there are so many more possibilities with the orientation of this big billowing peony, and you don't have to trim down your 8.5-inch panel because the side of the Stamp Wheel stage, this guide right here, comes off. So now your cardstock can overhang on the right side of your Stamp Wheel stage, enabling you to quickly mass produce cards. And I'll show you what I mean by that. On my Stamp Wheel stage, I'm going to position my cardstock, letting this right side overhang. Then with the Billowing Peonies outline stamp set, I'm going to find an orientation where I can cover the bottom segment of my panel. And once I'm happy with the placement, I can pick up my stamp with the flip plate, just like on the original Stamp Wheel. And until I can get my hands on a replacement sticky mat grid for the Stamp Wheel 2.0, I am going to do my best to keep my sticky mat grid free of blemishes. Instead of stamping the outline in a traditional black ink, I'm going to opt for a mid-tone brown ink. This is Mocha. And once I'm happy with my impression, and since I have this tape guide here, I can use it again to rotate my cardstock panel and bump the cardstock up to my guide and stamp my Billowing Peonies outline on this side of my cardstock. Again, I'm using Mocha fresh dye ink to stamp the outline of billowing peonies. So I'm happy with the placement of both of these images. Now I can start filling in this open area in the middle of my cardstock with some Build-A-Garden Breezy Petal images. Like all of the Build-A-Garden sets, there's an outline stamp, its coordinating stencil, and if you want to, you can choose to add the die set. Though it's not part of your normal subscription, I just love that you can quickly cut out the outlines of your stamped images, and sometimes you get the offset sentiment layers or some other embellishments that coordinate with your Build-A-Garden for that month. I will be using the add-on die set for this bundle, but really it's only for the sentiments. So right now I'm going to play around with the placement of where I want this bundle of flowers to go. And I'm using the stamp packaging as a way to plan the placement of this bundle because I want to try to fill up as much of my card as I can in one go. And I'm looking at the A, B, and C cluster here, this larger one. And as I've experimented with making 4-in-1 cards on the Stamp Wheel 2.0, I found it really helpful to get like a clear acetate guide cut to 4¼ by 5½ inches, so an A2 size panel, so I can make sure and overlay. So each of the 4 quadrants of my 8½ by 11 inch sheet have a lot of interest on them. And I also don't want to awkwardly cut like large images like the billowing peonies. So this is just a good way to visualize what each of your 4 cards are going to look like. I'm going to remove my guide that I have here. I don't think I need it anymore. Then I'm going to reposition my cardstock using this top left corner as my stability guide. Then I think if I position this stamp just like so, I don't think I should have to mask any portion of this image as I stamp it. You'll see that it almost creeps up to my 4¼ inch side here. And again, this is why this guide is really helpful for me as I plan out these 4-in-1 cards. So I'm going to pick up my Breezy Petals outline stamp, stamp the outline again in Mocha. And once I'm happy with that impression, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, I should be able to rotate my panel 180 degrees, bump it into this top left corner, and without removing the stamp on my flip plate, I should be able to fill in this open area down here. Perfect. And this should finish at least the outline floral stamping on this large panel. So after I clean out my outline stamp, I should be ready for stenciling. So now I can transfer my 8½ by 11 inch stamped sheet to my 9 by 12 sticky mat grid. So you might be wondering why you can't just do that on A2 size panels, 4 of them. And this is really the reason why, is because now that you have these large clusters, you can stencil this entire image in one go instead of in fragments. And like I demonstrated earlier, especially with the Billowing Peonies stamp set, you could really orient this image one way in the original stamp wheel. But now we can experiment, as you can see, with different orientations and different placements of this large image with the Stamp Wheel 2.0. It'll be mid to late November when this video publishes, so I thought I would experiment with a moody fall and winter palette. I'm starting with Pink Crystal on this peony, and since I have the same stencil out, I don't have to worry about cleaning it, because then I can rotate this stencil and position it on the other half of my panel. I'm using a mini ink blending brush to apply Pink Crystal, and I'm creating a halo of this color around the edge of the peony. So that finishes that layer. And the 9 by 12 inch sticky mat is perfect for 8½ inch sheets, because as you can see, I still get a lot of overhang, well, enough overhang to adhere my stencil on without using any of the satin masking tape. On this peony, I'll use Strawberry. And just like the previous flower, I'm just creating a halo of this color on the tips of the petals. I can orient my stencil really quickly and repeat the process. Again, I don't have to clean my stencil because I'm using the same color. So filling in this entire panel is going to work up really easily. And hopefully you can see the difference now, especially with this stencil, since both of the second layers are on this single stencil. So once I get the alignment just right on this image, and I'm worrying about this peony here, I used strawberry on this image, so then I'll move on to dusty pink. And on this layer, I'll use mauve. And I'll make sure not to cross over into my other peony right here that I just ink blended. So there's that layer. Then I can do the same thing on these two images. I'll keep going down the gradient of colors for each of the respective dye inks. So I know I'll need blush rose on this flower and berrylicious on this one. So that's the end result of this layer. Then finally I can work in the final color to both of these flowers using the number 5 stencil in Billowing Peonies. So that's Raspberry Sunset and Acai Berry. And that is those color layers on the other half of my panel. Then I can color the leaves on both of these images as well as the flower centers. So this is stencil layer number 6 for the leaves and these two centers. For a fall feeling foliage palette, I'm starting with Toasted Mauve. I like that this brown has red undertones to it. Kind of reminds me of how rose leaves, when they first bud, they have this sort of reddish undertone to them. And I've also got some burning bushes in my garden. And this is the overall impression that I'm getting for fall right now. So I'll keep those just on the leaves. Then for the peony center, I'll use Misty More. On the smaller bits on stencil number 6 for the flower center, I'll use Marshland. Then finally I can move on to Redwood for the detail leaf layers. Then I'll jump all the way down to Mangrove Root for the peony flower centers. And that'll finish the Billowing Peonies sets of layering images. And now, of course, that just leaves the Breezy Petals layering stencil set for this center portion of my panel. And again, the really wonderful thing about these outline sets that have coordinating stencils is that I don't have to worry about grouping fragmented panels in order to color and ink blend. It's so much faster to do this all in one step than to have to do it 4 separate times, one time for each panel. So on the larger grouping of flowers on the number 1 layer stencil, I did strawberry, and I'll repeat the color palette that I used on the Billowing Peonies on the Breezy Petals Build a Garden, so that this is all a cohesive palette and so that it looks intentional as well. So then I can just repeat this on the other side. So that's the first layer, then I can do the second layer. I'll add a halo of dusty pink where I applied strawberry ink. And this is all on this number 2 stencil. Then wherever I applied pink crystal, I'll apply a layer of mauve. On the number 3 stencil, I'll apply blush rose to all of the open areas of the petals. To color in the base of the leaves of all of the images, in Build a Garden Breezy Petals, I'm going to use the Woodland Garden Altenew Artist Marker Set and Toasted Mauve to quickly create a base layer on this entire panel. And filling in these layers takes no time at all. Then I can use the number 5 stencil to fill in the detail layers in the leaves, as well as all of the flower centers found in this set. So moving down from Toasted Mauve is Redwood. I'll fill in the flower centers to all of these images with a light touch of Mangrove Root. Then of course I can repeat this on the other side and fill in the detail layers of the leaves with Redwood. Of course, the more images that you stamp onto your 8.5-inch panel, the more you'll have to layer and stencil. But in the end, I can't think of a faster way to come up with 4 separate cards all at one time. Before I cut my panel apart, What I'm going to do to fill in some of these open areas is add some splatter. I have Espresso watercolor brush marker refill, and I'll add brown splatter instead of jet black ink spray, you know, my favorite way of adding splatter to any panel. I just think it gives a little bit more of that tea-stained antique look, and to me this is just a little bit more fitting for fall and winter. And no matter how much I mass produce cards, I seem to always run out during the holiday season. So for me, any technique that I can use to take the mundane task out of creating 4 of the same card, I just want to make sure I can pass that information on to you all and what I've learned along the way. So I think this needs just a little bit more splatter. The espresso splatter is really meant to fill in the open areas or the gaps that I have in between the bouquets, but pure white ink spray is what's going to give that dreamy halo or that frosted sort of look on these flowers. So this is pure white ink spray on a fine tipped Altenew water brush. To save myself some time while this dries, I'm going to go ahead and get some sentiments ready. And like I mentioned, I'm using the Breezy Petals add-on die set just for the sentiments. You can stamp directly on your panels if that's what you choose. But I love when a stamp set like the Build-A-Garden Breezy Petals has the coordinating offset dies to create really refined sentiment banners. I cut apart my panel into 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch quadrants. And now you'll see I'm left with an array of different backgrounds that I can use for my sentiments. Like I mentioned, I used the Breezy Petals sentiments and the coordinating die set, and now I can find various places to tuck in these sentiments on all 4 of my panels. I foam mounted all of the sentiments to their respective panels, and that finishes an easy way to create 4 cards using 1 panel. Get your hands on the Stamp Wheel 2.0 and look at your stash for outline stamps that have coordinating stencils in clusters, and you'll be sure to finish your next batch of cards in a breeze.
If you love the look of watercolor but want to achieve it with fresh dye ink, Jaycee has you covered in this video tutorial.
Hey there, Altenew friends, welcome to another perfect pairing episode with me. In this card making tutorial, I have 2 faux watercolor techniques to show you. Keep watching to find out how I used the newest Altenew Dynamic Duo to create a stunning watercolor card without a watercolor palette. Before we get into today's project, make sure you subscribe to the Altenew channel for more card making and paper crafting tutorials. My Perfect Pairings with Jaycee series explores crafting techniques that effortlessly blend sure-to-love new releases and well-loved Altenew favorites. If you love these kinds of crafty tutorials, hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of my videos airing on the 2nd and 4th Sunday. New for October 2024 is the Dynamic Duo Playful Watercolor Flowers. If you have never heard of the Dynamic Duo Altenew subscription, I have more details on that in the description box. And what's exciting is that every month you can get the stamp and stencil set at a discounted price, and the product stock is guaranteed every time, so you never miss out on an excellent pairing. As the name suggests, you get the stamp set and its coordinating layering stencil set. You'll see that the outlines in the stamp set coordinate with the open areas of the stencil set. And the stencil set in this Dynamic Duo creates 2 different groupings. So there are many different combinations you can experiment with and orientations on your card front, which is what we'll do today. For my stenciling surface, I'll use the 9x12 Altenew Sticky Matte Grid, and this will help hold my white cardstock panel and my stencils together. I'm following the layering guide found on the stencil packaging, and I'm starting with the number 1 layers for the first grouping of flowers on my card. I want to orient them on the bottom left corner and angle them in a way so I show the leaves and flowers all on the same panel. Since the number 1 set of images is more of my background element to this card, I'm deciding to go with more muted palettes. And the colors I'm using are from the Deco Garden Fresh Dye Ink set. And I'm just going to do a mix of Pool, Mid Yellow, and Olive to color this array of images. I'm grabbing many ink blending brushes that coordinate with my set of inks. And again, this is my background element, so I'm applying light washes of Mid Yellow to random areas of this grouping of leaves and centers of flowers. And I purposefully picked colors that are analogous on the color wheel from Deco Garden. So these colors are next to each other on the color wheel so that I know that they blend effortlessly into each other. And what I hope to emulate with this technique is a wet on wet feel, just like watercolor, for a smooth gradient and blend of colors. So I did a little bit of mid-yellow pool, and I'm adding just a little touch of Olaf to some of the edges of the leaves. By the way, I started with the A3 layer first because it gave me an idea of where to space my entire arrangement, since I know I'll be adding other elements to this background. So now I can sort of work backwards. And what I've done in the stencil is align the A2 layer, so it's these two images here. And what I've done to align this image is use the open areas of the image and the etching that's found in the A2 grouping to get a rough placement of where these flowers and this leaf image is supposed to go. It's not going to be perfect. The idea with this dynamic duo, playful watercolor flowers, is that it is playful. It's not supposed to be exact. So you have a lot of room to experiment with placement. I'm just going to focus on this leaf down here. And again, I'm going to do that loose watercolor and loose ink blending approach. This time I'm starting with Olaf. I'm going to apply a deeper layer here. Mix in a little bit of pool wherever I feel like it feels good. And then lastly, adding a touch of mid-yellow. Then before I remove the stencil, I want to color this image. So I'm applying a generous layer of mid-yellow. And then in some of the remaining open areas, I'll use another mini ink blending tool to add a touch of dusty pink. So that's the A3 and A2 layer done. Now I can align the A1 layer. That's these two open areas of flowers. And again, just light touches of dusty pink and even lighter blends of mid-yellow. That's the A1 grouping of images from the dynamic duo. I'm going to do a little bit of rearranging here just to get placement for the number 2 stencil in the set. The number 2 stencil has 4 layers of images this time, so that's B1 through 4. And I'm using the open areas of the B1 stencil to get an idea of how big this bouquet is on my background. And I'm angling it in such a way so that I encompass leaves and flowers, but in that sort of loose feeling again. I'll stick with the same 4 color palette that I did earlier. And again, for the leaves, I'll do a light mix of pool, very light touches of Olaf, and then finishing the grouping with mid-yellow. I'll move on to the B2 image following the etching found in the stencil. And just like the flowers in the number 1 stencil, I'm using mid-yellow and dusty pink to color in these open areas. Then I'll position and align the B3 sets of images, so that's this grouping here and a little bit of up here. And again, I've mixed dusty pink with touches of mid-yellow, and that'll loosely fill in this open area of petals. Then finally, I can use the open area and the leaves to align this set of petals right here. And that'll be my last mix of dusty pink and mid-yellow to finish this background. I wanted to get the stenciling done in the background panel first so that I can use the stamps all at the same time. So this is the coordinating outline stamp set to the dynamic duo playful watercolor flowers. And I'm transferring my panel to the stamp wheel just so I can be sure I have great placement. In my stamp wheel, I have my slim grip mat. The idea with these sets of outline images is that they don't fit exactly into the images that they coordinate with. So you do have a little bit of creative freedom. If you see an outline image kind of fits into a shape, then go ahead and use it. It might work out for you in an unexpected way. So even though I have all of my leaf images and petal images in my stamp wheel right now, I'm going to selectively color some of these outlines. So for my outlines that are more geared towards the petals, I'm going to color these separately than the leaves. In fact, it might be easier if I start with the leaves first. And what I'm doing is applying a light dab of ink just to the leaf layers. And I don't want this ink to be at full saturation on my panel. So what I'm actually doing is using the same mini ink blending brush to pick up some of the ink so that I get a light ghost outline in my panel. Same with the petals. I'm using dusty pink to apply the ink, but then I'll use a mini ink blending brush, a coordinating mini ink blending brush, to remove some of that ink. And if I feel like I ever need more ink, then I can certainly apply more. In this case, it might take 2 or 3 layers to build an image. Then lastly, in this cluster of flowers here, I'll use that last outline leaf stamp. And this time I'll use pool to color this cluster of leaves. Moving on to the other cluster of leaves and flowers on the top right corner. I'm grabbing outline images as I see fit for the stenciled layers below and applying hazy outlines of the stamp. And this background is beautiful on its own. You can add one of the coordinating sentiments found in Dynamic Duo, Playful Watercolor Flowers. But this Dynamic Duo reminded me of another bundle in my stash, and I wanted to showcase another faux watercolor technique that you can use with your ink pads that doesn't involve actual watercolor. So I will remove this panel from my stamp wheel, let it fully dry, and work on the other element that I want to include on this card. On another white cardstock panel, I'll add this to my stamp wheel Slim Grip Matte. And the floral stamp set I want to pair with the Dynamic Duo is this. This is the Sketched Florals layering stamp set with its coordinating die set. And you'll see that the stamp set sort of mimics the open area and loose feel of the Dynamic Duo, which is why I thought this was such a perfect pairing for this card. You'll see that in the layering guide found in this stamp set that the solid images loosely fit with the outlines, so we can really experiment with playful color blends with inks. In my stamp wheel, I have the solid images H1 and A1. I'm partially inking these images, and starting from lightest to darkest ink, in my case this is mid-yellow, I'm partially inking up this image layer, and then with the mini ink blending brush, I'm diffusing the harsh line that I left and stamping the image. If you're longtime watchers of my Perfect Pairing series, you'll remember I used to do this with the Build-A-Flower layering stamp sets before they transitioned to the Build-A-Garden layering stencil and stamp sets. But this is a technique I love to return to whenever I grab my loved Build-A-Flower stamp sets from Altenew. So for this next layer, I'm using Dusty Pink, and again, I've partially inked up the image to apply a layer of Dusty Pink. And if I feel like I need more, that's the wonderful thing about the stamp wheel, is that I can repeat stamp as many times as I need to get a perfect impression. And there are colors in the Deco Garden set that I haven't used yet, like Coral Red. And I left these colors out on purpose so that I can incorporate them into more of these focal images for my card. So again, I'll partially ink up the stamp and diffuse the harsh lines that are left with a mini ink blending brush, and then stamp. I want to include one more flower image. This is the E1 layer, and I want to do a gradient of Dusty Pink and Coral Red on this image. And you'll see I really like this granular texture I get in all of the flowers. It kind of gives that cold pressed watercolor feel. So that's why you really don't see any sort of smoothness within the flower. Just a nice transition between colors is all I'm really looking for. I'm going to add the flower centers to the A1 and H1 layers with the A2 and H2 stamps. And I will simply stamp that in mid-yellow. Then I will align the outline images to all of the solid layers. So that's the H3, A3, and E2 layers. Then I'm applying diffused layers of Coral Red and Dusty Pink to finish the flower images in this set. I'm incorporating the leaf images as well, so this is the G1, F1, and I1 layers. And I'm going to switch up the palette and again incorporate a color that we haven't used yet from Deco Garden Fresh Dye Ink set, and use Pool, Olive, and Navy. And just like the flowers, I'm diffusing and adding ink to the solid layers. So I'm starting with Pool, then Olive, then finally Navy. Lastly, we'll add the outlines to all of the solid layers, so that's F2, G2, and I2. And to these outline images, I've diffused a little bit of navy and mixed it with Olive to finish the outlines to these solid images. Before I put away the stamp set, I've added the From All of Us sentiment. And I love this sentiment because you can complete it on the inside of the card. So, if you don't have an occasion to send this card for yet, the From All of Us sentiment is a catch-all for many different occasions. And I'm making a gradient of navy and pool just to give this sentiment banner a little bit more interest. Then of course, once that's all stamped, I can use its coordinating dies to cut out the images. After die cutting all of my stamped images, I can begin to arrange everything on my background panel. I want everything to sort of flow in this direction since I have clusters of flowers over in the top right and the bottom left corners. I've glued down the leaves and foam mounted the flowers But before I finish the card with the sentiment and some other embellishments, I feel like it's necessary to help frame the more focal floral arrangement here with a little bit more outlines just to draw your attention to this area specifically. So in these sketched florals and the dynamic duo images, I'm grabbing the outline images, and just with an acrylic block I'm adding little embellishments here and there. Like I stamped the C2 layer from sketched florals up in this corner, and I'm using pool and an outline stamp from the dynamic duo to add a cluster of leaves down here. And I feel like these outlines help really draw your attention to this area of the whole bouquet. Now that I've added these additional outlines, I can go ahead and add splatter. I'm using the ink from Navy, fresh dye ink, and I'll suspend this ink in water so I can add an array of splatter all around my card to help frame and give that loose watercolor feel in my panel. Now I can add my sentiment banner to this bouquet, and I feel like adding the crystal clear enamel dots is going to help really enforce the watercolor feel of this card. And after adding this card to a folded note card base, that finishes this faux watercolor card using inking techniques that you can use throughout your Altenew stash. Again, if you haven't checked out the Altenew Dynamic Duo subscription, please take a look at the description box, as well as find out what other Altenew subscription services might be suitable for you. Give these two faux watercolor techniques a try, and let me know what you think in the comments.
Send cards with love and sympathy in this tutorial with Jaycee, where he makes 2 projects in just 3 simple steps.
Hi there everyone, it's Jaycee. Sometimes it's hard to find the right words to say when someone you know has lost someone. In this card making tutorial, I'll share 3 personal ways to get yourself started for when you want to show someone that they're not alone. Altenew's crafting supplies cover many occasions, even ones that carry heavy emotions. In order to make a sympathy card, I've found 3 steps to get you started, but every situation is unique. You can always adapt these sympathy crafting themes based on your culture, ritual, or relationship to the recipient. For me, a muted and neutral color palette is a great place to start. I always have spicy yogurt cardstock on hand when I want to add something neutral, but not too bright or dark. The little bit of speckling texture is also a plus for simple floral arrangements. So on the same theme of neutral palettes, a little bit of texture is also comforting. This Journey Abroad hot foil plate can be used as an embossing texture plate simply by switching up the sandwich on your die cutting machine. I just have to modify the illustrative steps on my die cutting platform. From back to front is the hot foil plate, texture side up, then my cardstock, the embossing mat, but instead of the embossing plate, I'll add my standard cutting plate. What I'm left with is this very soft impression on this panel. I'll set this aside and work on the focal elements. Depending on your culture, flowers can be used as a symbolic gift. I like this Plum Blossoms layering die set because it's a very neutral shape and it's not too showy. We can easily modify this bouquet into a soft arrangement. I will cut all the flower elements in white cardstock and all the foliage elements in vellum. After following the simple layering guide on the back of the die set packaging, I'll arrange these flowers in this split arrangement. This arrangement will help frame my sentiment. I found my Simple Sympathy sentiment in this elegant sayings stamp and die bundle. However, in your stash, a more common sentiment you may come across is thinking of you. I love that sentiment for sympathy cards, or you can stamp that sentiment as a start for the inside notes of the card. I'll stamp the sympathy sentiment in Evening Gray from Warm Gray Crisp dye ink, then use its coordinating die to add to the center of this bouquet. To finish this card, I'll embellish the bouquet with a bit of splatter from the Moonrock ink pad. You can always modify this bouquet for other symbolic flowers of passing, such as poppies, lilies, or a chrysanthemum, to name a few, but your crafting stash may have other symbols or symbolic images that can bring comfort and hope. So for my second example, I'm basing my card on the mourning dove, a common Western and North American symbol of visitation and peace. To start, I'm adding a bit of texture from Moroccan Tile 3D embossing folder to balance the flat lay that I have planned for focal elements. I embossed an A2 sized panel of spicy yogurt cardstock and trimmed it to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. Then I foam mounted this panel to another A2 panel of spicy yogurt cardstock. This Bird of the Mountain die set is very versatile. I'm going to modify this color palette for this Sympathy card. I die cut all the layers from white cardstock except the following: layer 2, layer 4, and the die cluster that contains the beak, eye, and feet. Personally, I preferred adding instant dimension foam tape between layers 2 and 3, and 4 and 5. Feel free to leave out the instant dimension foam tape if you're not hand delivering this card. To balance this card color palette, I'm adding in black leaves. These leaves come from the Plum Blossom die set. Now all I need is a sentiment. I think hello sentiments are suitable for cards about grief, or they can at least give you a place to start before adding a personal note to the inside of the card. This hello sentiment and bird motif are also in Bird of the Woods stamp and die bundle, just in his example. Another common sentiment I found amongst my Altenew stash is the Sweet Ginkgo stamp set. I found a few comfort and hope sentiments scattered across various Altenew categories. I'll use this sentiment as a banner for my card front. So then, what about the inside? Altenew has this sentiment stamp set called With Deepest Sympathy. I love that these sentiments are perfect for when it's hard to find the right words to say. They're a great start to adding in a more personal written sentiment for your card. So aside from simple messages for sympathy cards, I also suggested muted color palettes and calming symbols for your personal handmade cards centered around grief and healing.
Every card maker, be it beginner or experienced crafter, must learn these 3 practical techniques from Jaycee.
Hi there, Altenew friends. Happy New Year and welcome back. I have 3 essential card making techniques every stamper should know, whether you're new to card making or an expert. In this video, let's look at practical ways of using some of these basic crafting techniques. The style of these cards will be mostly simple with distinct focal points and elements. To keep things consistent, I'm focusing on the Retro Bicycle stamp and die bundle, and I'll use the stamp set in all 3 card examples today. I love the stamp set because the sentiment banners have their own dies for perfect sentiment placement every time. My first essential card making technique is masking. This may come in the form of a mask stencil or by making your own for layered floral arrangements. Again, to keep things simple, I'm using the halftone circles nesting die to make my own center cut stencil on white cardstock. Altenew has the circle frame mask stencil, but I didn't get my crafty hands on it. With this mask stencil, I'm making 3 consistent solid circles on another piece of white cardstock. In the soft pastel mini ink cube bundle, I'm using the 3 primaries in this set to color the cardstock. I'll start with Mango Smoothie in the center of my background. Then I'll shift the stencil to the left and blend Rouge. Finally, I'll shift the stencil to the right and ink blend Ocean Waves. Mask stenciling and ink blending go hand in hand. By using solid stencils and a little color theory, you can make modern color-blocked backgrounds. Now with just these 3 colors, I have the perfect background element to frame my retro bicycle. I trimmed down the color triad to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. And now I'll work on the retro bicycle. To oppose the rainbow background, I'll keep the retro bicycle focal image neutral gray. So using Rock Collection, I'll stamp the A1 layer in Industrial Diamond, A2 in Pure Graphite, A3 in Limestone, A4 in Silverstone, and A5 in Permanent Black Crisp ink. I'll foam mount the background, color triad, and all the die cut pieces, including the sentiments. Then I'll embellish this card with essential black and white enamel dots. This card involves simple masking and ink blending for a simple colored card design, perfect for smaller or growing crafting collections. Speaking of crafting collections, embossing folders are a crafting staple. I love them for the addition of color and texture. I'm using the Cool Doodles 3D embossing folder to do both for my next essential card making technique. Embossing on white cardstock is great, but embossing on colored or pattern paper is even better. I'm starting with a 6x6 panel of pattern paper from the Wildflower paper pack. To minimize cracking, I'm using the Fine Mister spray bottle with water to adequately saturate the paper before running it through my embossing folder sandwich on my manual die cutting machine. I'm left with this embossed background panel. After letting the paper dry back a bit, I'll use Toasted Mauve, fresh dye ink, to apply color on the text side of the embossing folder. This will give me a relief printed background onto the pattern paper. As a quick tip, I like to pick colors that are a slightly darker shade than the base color for effortless blending when relief ink printing. So now I have this embossed background with bold doodle motifs that fits the retro-themed bicycle. Since I have the Woodland Escape Fresh Dye inks out, I'll use Pink Sand for the A1 layer of the retro bicycle, Industrial Diamond on the A2 layer, Dusty Rose on the A3 layer, Toasted Mauve on the A4 layer, and Permanent Black Crisp ink on the A5 layer. To oppose all the rounded lines and shapes of this card, I'm using the Mini Instant Camera Frame die to cut vellum. Then I'll create a focal area with the frame and bicycle on top of the relief printed and embossed background. This single tone card now has a lot of texture and dimension, and by using ink with your embossing folders, you can create machine-like precision that will make your card recipient think you bought your greeting card at the store. If you're looking for more embossing folder techniques, I've got a whole class worth of them over at Altenew Academy. It's called Embossing Folders, Basics to Brilliance. And there I essentially cover everything that you can do with embossing folders that even goes beyond paper. Then speaking of precision, I actually struggle to do the opposite for my watercoloring. As much as I love the freehand and effortless look of loose watercoloring, I have a hard time making it myself. Over time, I've learned that the following technique works really well for me. I'm starting with a few panels of the 9x12 cold-pressed watercolor paper. On the smoother side of this beautiful white watercolor paper, I'm heat embossing the floral outlines of Nostalgic Floral's stamp set. I used Altenew Platinum Crisp embossing powder to make both of my heat embossed images. This is where I like to use the embossed resist technique to make loose watercolor florals. My secret to coloring these flowers is the woodless watercolor pencil set. I will saturate the watercolor paper with my Fine Mister spray bottle until I see significant water droplets forming. Then with the open edge of a pair of scissors and a woodless watercolor pencil, I'll gently scrape away at the pencil pigment to create a fine powder. This will readily disperse on the water droplets, giving me instant color. I'll repeat this with other colors, balancing large areas of wide open space with intense color saturation. If your colors get muddy, you can always lift the water and pigment with a paper towel, like how I'm doing in the center of the flower. Then I can repeat this for the leaves of the floral clusters. So this lays down a solid foundation of color. In order to create depth in this loose watercolor heat embossed resist, I'll use the pencil to drop more intense color where I perceive shadows in the flowers and leaves. The watercolor paper is still slightly damp, which is why I don't get solid blocks of color. It still looks effortless and hazy. I let the panels air dry before die cutting them to reveal loose watercolor florals that don't look muddy and still have dimension. I finished this card by raising the loose watercolor florals on top of my folded note card base. Then I foam mounted the retro bicycle and sentiment. This time I used Blue Mountain's fresh dye ink bundle. After trimming down the overhang, I embellished the card with bronze splatters from the 14 metallic watercolor pan set and antique gold sequins. By using heat embossed resist techniques, we can create effortless loose watercolor florals that balance the solid layers of the retro bicycle for this whimsical scene. In summary, we used masking, embossing folders, and heat embossing to create color-blocked, textural, and effortless applications of these essential crafting techniques.
We hope you enjoyed revisiting the best tutorials from Jaycee. If this compilation inspired you, be sure to save it and come back to it whenever you need a creative boost. What other compilations would you like to see? Share it in the comments below. Loved watching this video. There is more where that came from here on the Altenew official YouTube channel. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that bell button so you don't miss out on any of the crafty fun. See you soon and happy crafting.